Hello everybody, and welcome to the presentation of my research project called Blindspot, the problem of art history's theoretical unidimensionality. October magazine is one of art history's most influential journals. It is so influential that Matthew Milliner once joked that in the field of art history, it is always October. In 2004, October released a book titled Art Since 1900, Modernism, Anti-Modernism, Postmodernism. In the beginning of this book, they outline the methodologies of art history in four broad categories: structuralism, post-structuralism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis. These categories effectively summarize the current array of methodologies in contemporary art history. This gives us a sense of art history's current theoretical breadth, telling us what could possibly be covered, but more importantly for my research, what is not being covered. All of these frameworks, like the institutions that propose them, assume a Western secular worldview. And while this is fine, or even ideal, for feminist critiques or studies of class difference in Western secular culture, it is problematic for dealing with art by non-Western or non-secular cultures. The assumed secularity of these frameworks make them blind to anything not non-secular, and lead to the inevitable mistreating of art from cultures with opposing worldviews, such as this piece here by Canadian artist Bill Reid, who has claimed expressly that his artworks are living religious realities for both him and his culture. So, in this presentation, I will go over a rough outline of my research project, starting with the problem, where I'll go into a little more depth on the problem already covered in my introduction. Then I will move on to proposed solutions, where I will go over the relevant scholarship and some of the ideas on how the invisibility of religion in art history and criticism could be rectified. And then I will finally move on to my conclusion, where I will conclude that while the theoretical frameworks of contemporary art history and criticism are limited by their materialistic unidimensionality, the reintegration of religion is not only possible, but it is probable. And here's an artwork by Janet McKenzie that won Sister Wendy Beckett's Jesus 2000 competition, a competition that art historian James Elkins, who I will get to in a bit, argued has no place in the conversation of serious art history. Art historian James Elkins wrote that sooner or later, if you love art, you will come across a strange fact. There is almost no modern religious art in museums or books of art history. It is a state of affairs that is at once obvious and odd, known to everyone, yet hardly whispered about. This is kind of what I was getting at in my introduction. That, as seen in the October frameworks, which assume a secular Western worldview, there is no space for religion at all. It's not even part of the conversation. And Jonathan Anderson continues here that religion might very well be reappearing in contemporary artworks, but until there are rigorous critical methods for accounting for it, this reappearance will remain problematized, or simply functionally invisible. The invisibility of religion in the writing on contemporary art is symptomatic of a wider systemic problem. This is a problem that stems from Enlightenment thought, but has been recently reinforced by postmodern and post-structuralist thinking. The result is what Jonathan Anderson calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, where everything is treated with a certain level of skepticism and cynicism, where religion is no longer religion, but rather part of a state superstructure, a tool for the strong to hold down the weak. Another contributing factor to art religion's invisibility is the institutional definition of art. That's where art is defined by its supporting institutions, such as the auction houses, the museums, academia. Everything within these, everything that these institutions consider art is art, everything outside is not. This creates kind of a closed system of meaning, a self-referential loop where things like the October frameworks were devised, where a lot of Western secular art is made. And everything outside of this closed loop is all but ignored. This can be seen in Rosalind Krauss's essay, Grids, where she looks at paintings like Pierre Mondrian's composition with red, blue, and yellow that we see here as emblems of modernity. That's kind of her argument. Only admitting for a second at the end of the essay that these artists, some of these artists, saw them as a bridge to the sacred. And in doing so, she points out her embarrassment at considering religion in an art historical essay. Here's an artwork that Jonathan Anderson uses as an example of something that was mistreated by contemporary art critics. In all of the literature pertaining to Tim Hawkinson's art piece, Pentecost, there were no explicit religious references, except for, in one case, a half-sentence explanation of the biblical reference in the title. Everything else was formalist analyses and critiques pertaining to that closed system of meaning that I mentioned on the previous slide. Now we get to the proposed solutions section of the presentation. Here I'll talk about some of the scholars who have struggled to find a solution to this divide between religion and art history. These scholars include James Elkins, Sally Promy, Jeffrey Koski, and Jonathan Anderson. But we'll start with Jeffrey Koski. Jeffrey Koski, in his book, The Arts of Reenchantment, talks about his disenchantment with modern disenchantment and looks at artworks that he sees as reenchanting, such as Goldsworthy and James Turrell. And most of the common theme that runs throughout the book is a lack of human autonomy in the artworks. This leads to a sort of romantic sublime, where the viewer is faced with a sort of power greater than themselves. And the result is a vague spirituality, but never anything close to an organized religion. James Elkins plays the role of devil's advocate a lot, and he sticks to the institutional definition of art, which leads him to some pessimistic conclusions. And I think this quote that I have here from his book, The Strange Place of Religion in the Contemporary Art, I think really just summarizes a lot of what he gets at. So, committed, engaged, ambitious, informed art does not mix with dedicated, serious, thoughtful, heartfelt religion. Wherever the two meet, one wrecks the other. Either the art is loose and unambitious, or the religion is one-dimensional and unpersuasive. And I think Jeffrey Koski fits into the second half of that, where he leads to sort of, his conclusions lead to a sort of vague theosophy, nothing persuasive. Jonathan Anderson takes a different approach. He's more on the religious side of things. He's a art historian, but also a theologian, and his argument is more of a call to action for religious scholars, where he argues that the invisibility of religion in contemporary art is more due to religion's failure to write persuasively or compellingly on art. And he strongly encourages, as a solution, that scholars become proficient interdisciplinarily. So where one scholar, in order to actually integrate religion into art in writing, a scholar would have to be both an expert on a given religion and on art. And while this is an insurmountable task for one scholar, the new proliferation that we're seeing, and he doesn't really get to this in his essay, but when we get to Sally Promy, we'll connect the dots. But we're seeing a proliferation of interdisciplinary study where multiple scholars are teaming up to address subjects that are kind of between disciplines. And that's where Sally Promy comes in. She champions visual culture studies and sociology as the answer for this divide between religion and the writing on contemporary art, and has personally done studies with the likes of David Morgan that kind of bridge the gap. Like they did a book with a group of other scholars called The Visual Culture of American Religions, where they address the plethora of visual artifacts from various American religions in a space like the one that Jonathan Anderson hinted at, between the disciplines. In this study, they looked at religion as part of the social, cultural, and practical work of images. While the theoretical frameworks of contemporary art history and criticism are currently limited by their materialistic unidimensionality, the most fruitful path forward from the relevant scholarship appears to be through interdisciplinary study. And while the two, religion and the writing on contemporary art, are impossible to rectify within the closed systems of meaning, as pointed out by James Elkins, in this kind of in-between space of interdisciplinary study, the impossible is made possible. And as Margaret Dakovitskaya points out in her book Visual Culture, the study of the visual after the cultural return, the trends of the modern university point towards the proliferation of these interdisciplinary fields. As funding dries up in humanities programs across the board, universities turn to these programs as a way to consolidate faculty and funding, and it becomes the practical progression of the humanities, which will eventually lead to the dissolution of these kind of hard line distinctions between something like art history and religious studies, eventually leading to theoretical frameworks that can kind of bridge the gap interdisciplinarily between religion and art. When you combine this progression in the humanities with the fact that so many scholars, I've only gone over 4, but so many scholars are writing on this issue, the outlook for a solution is positive. As more people contribute to the conversation and interdisciplinary study becomes more and more popular, it is only a matter of time before art history can address religious artifacts in a holistic manner. Thank you for listening.